Good morning. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. And yesterday was President Biden's first formal press conference in the White House. And right there in the front row was Washington Post White House correspondent Sunmin Kim. Sunmin, welcome back to First Look.
Thanks for having me.
All right. You were there in the room. Give us your impressions. How did the president do?
So it was certainly a lengthy press conference that he received a lot of questions on issues that we were hoping to hear from him more in depth. Obviously, the top of those issues were at the border. I think reporters and people who have been following the issue are also seeking more clarity from the president on the filibuster and what exactly he supports and what's going to push him, if anything, to potential abolishment of the filibuster. But I think for his first formal press conference, he obviously he appeared to handle it mostly well. He was extremely prepared. He was frequently looking through notes that I'm sure his aides had prepared for him. He had been going through some practice sessions and doing some briefings in preparation for this press conference. I think he was able to prove, for the most part, that he could hold his own with the press, and hopefully we will have more of these exchanges in the future.
Well, Sudman, one of the things, yes, he covered a lot of ground on filibuster, voting rights, immigration, but there was not one single question about the pandemic, about the coronavirus. What happened there? How would you explain that omission to the average American?
It was actually really interesting, and because I chose to ask my question about something else, but I certainly did expect the pandemic to come up in some fashion. I had prepared about 7 different questions on 7 different topics, and I did have one related to the pandemic. I did want to ask about schools, but I was the third person called on, and I felt I wanted to use my time to ask about the filibuster instead. It was sort of a game time decision, if you will. But on the one hand, yes, we should have asked about the coronavirus pandemic. It is something that that has killed half a million Americans. Something that is affecting people's lives every day. But at the same time, a press conference is a time for reporters to really kind of set the agenda and ask the president of the United States questions on some things that the White House hasn't been able to fully address. And obviously, with the pandemic, he and his aides talk about that every day. Every day of their administration is focused on the pandemic. He began his press conference by announcing new vaccine goals because he had sailed past his initial goal of 100 million shots administered in 100 days. And look, frankly, if the 10 reporters there could better kind of coordinate questions, that would be one thing. But obviously, we are all separate news outlets, kind of working for a different readership and what we feel would best evoke the most interesting answer and most illuminating answer from the president.
Well, Sunmin, that's not to say that the question you asked was not important, and it was, and your question was on the filibuster, and it looms over pretty much his entire agenda. Immigration, voting rights, $15 minimum wage, the impending huge infrastructure package he's expected to send to Congress. So explain why the filibuster is key and why it was important for you to ask the question that you did. And in that response, tell us if you learned anything new from the president in his response.
So you're right. The filibuster is not just an arcane Senate procedural tool. It is the key to whether President Biden and the Democrats' very ambitious domestic policy agenda can pass before the 2020 midterms. Because remember, the procedure used to pass the $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief package. That could pass with a simple majority of Senate votes, but that is a tool that is rarely used. You can only use it for a certain amount of things, and Democrats can actually only use it one more time this year. So in terms of other major priorities, so you're talking about voting rights, the big HR 1 legislation that passed the Senate, passed the House, gun reform measures, expanded background checks legislation that has also cleared the House, and certainly immigration legislation, particularly a pathway to citizenship for dreamers, those young undocumented immigrants who came here as children. Those are priorities for Democrats that need 60 votes in the Senate. And right now, there are not 60 votes in the Senate for any of those priorities. And so that's why obviously President Biden doesn't get a vote on changing the filibuster rules, but he certainly has a big bully pulpit and could potentially persuade senators who are on the fence. And I thought it was really important to ask him. I think most times when he's been asked about the filibuster, he had been asked generically, do you want to get rid of it? Do you want to change it? And that's all fine. But in terms of the agenda, what really matters is whether legislation can pass with just 60 votes or with just 51 votes or 60 votes. And President Biden had never really been asked that. So I wanted to ask, that's how I phrased my question. And I didn't really get a clear answer. So I think that tells me that he's still unwilling to go as far as many in the party who are willing to go abolish that 60 vote threshold to advance most legislation in the Senate. And at this point, while President Biden may be keeping his options open, he's not willing to go that far just yet.
I would love to have a sit down with the president and ask him point blank, okay, what's your strategy? Because I do think there's a strategy here. But moving on, immigration. That was the first question from the reporters right off the bat, and there were many questions about the administration and what it's doing about the surge at the border, including press access to facilities holding unaccompanied minors. It didn't seem like the reporters in the East Room were satisfied on the access questions. Were you?
I think the reason why we didn't appear to be satisfied with the access questions is that, first of all, neither President Biden nor the White House has laid out a timeline by which there can be independent media access into these facilities. And the second point is that so far, where the media has been allowed access in is in the facilities that are run by Health and Human Services. That's where the unaccompanied minor children are supposed to go under law. These facilities are equipped to care for children. They are clean. They have ample play areas. And this is where the children will be taken care of until they can be reunited with sponsors, family members who are already in the United States. The problem right now, all the images that you've been seeing of these overcrowded facilities with these foam mattresses that are just an inch apart from each other, and that are these facilities that are clearly not equipped for children, they're actually under the control of the Customs and Border Protection, which is where these children first go. They cannot be held there for longer than 72 hours under law, even though they've been held for days longer than that right now during these ongoing challenges at the border. And that's the location where reporters have been blocked from access. And that's where I believe the public should be really aware of these awful conditions for children so that we can push, the administration, Congress, policymakers to take care of these children better.
I'm going to have to skip the infrastructure question I had for you because we're running out of time. But my last question for you is this, and that's, okay, we already talked about the fact that there wasn't a single question about the coronavirus pandemic, but there were more than a few questions to President Biden about his plans to run for re-election. He's not even 100 days into a 1,461-day term. Why do you think reporters wasted time on such a question?
So I think that oftentimes, especially in a wide kind of ranging press conference, there's usually one kind of question like that about his political future, perhaps not two, but there's usually one. And I think for reporters, it was important for us to pin him down on that point for a couple of reasons. One, during the presidential campaign, he kind of hinted that he may not run for a second term. He always kind of framed himself as the bridge to the next generation of the party, especially at a time when the Democratic Party is really agitating for new faces, new voices. The Democratic Party chose as a standard bearer the oldest president in U.S. history as its nominee and obviously as its president. And the second point is just that fact. He is the oldest president to have ever taken office in U.S. history. So certainly questions about his plans for the future are going to be part of the questions that we are ask him. I did find his answer interesting and very much in character that says, he has never kind of questioned fate. He doesn't plan years in advance. So I think that's kind of classic Joe Biden there.
Right, I agree with you. His response made me chuckle because it's like, of course this man isn't going to tempt fate by giving absolutes about his future, no matter his age. Seung-min, as always, we've run out the clock. Thank you very much for coming back to First Look. Have a good weekend.
For having me.
Now let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find Washington Post columnists Eugene Robinson and Megan McArdle. Welcome back.
Thanks, Jonathan.
And Gene, I'm having a bit of deja vu because I just saw you moments ago on Morning Joe. So thanks for sticking around in front of the camera. All right, let's talk about President Biden's first formal press conference at the White House yesterday. Your impressions, Gene. I'll start with you.
Well, first of all, compared to what we're used to over the last 4 years, it was calm. It was staid. It was informational. It was at times almost boring, and I think that's a great thing. I think that's a wonderful thing for the country. It was much more what a presidential press conference ought to be. I know that on conservative media, the president's been criticized for bringing a briefing book to the press conference. In other words, for actually preparing and choosing his words carefully. And look, this is what we're accustomed to seeing. Presidents choose their words carefully because those words mean a whole lot to people around the world, not just what he says, but how he says it. And so I thought that's what it was. I mean, from the point of view of the administration, I thought it was successful. And from the point of view of the media, I also thought it was mostly successful. I would have asked a question about the pandemic. That's still the major factor in all of our lives right now. And I think there are many unanswered questions going forward. But it was a regular press conference, and wasn't that wonderful?
Megan, what did you think? I mean, I agree with Gene. It was boring, not in a pejorative sense. And it was also super wonky. I got lost in the weeds in a lot of his answers. Your impression about the president's first press conference?
I really don't have that much to add to that. It was restful. It was so nice to be rested and just like, I'm just gonna float along on the normal questions and the normal demeanor, and nothing's blowing up, and I'm not thinking about like who has the nuclear football right now. And that is all to the good. But I mean, that's actually part of the problem is like, it was such a boring press conference that I don't have like a really exciting take to add to that, except it's nice to be back to more normal times.
Well, and I mean, that is, I think, the normal take. It's like we can breathe a sigh of relief. It was normal, a president who wants to actually talk about policies and not use the time to attack people, whether elected officials or private citizens. But it's not about me, it's about him, the president. Gene, there was only one reporter question about gun control, and the conversation was limited despite the fact that the country is reeling from 2 mass shootings in the span of 8 days. And you wrote a column about the scourge of guns in America, and you concede that meaningful gun control is unlikely at this time. But given what we've seen, would it even matter, gun control?
That's a very good question. I mean, what if we banned the sale of guns tomorrow? There would still be 120 guns in this country for every 100 people, um, uh, and, uh, and so we are awash in firearms in a way that no other country on Earth is really, at least according to the group that does an authoritative survey of that sort of thing. I wish I had the blinding flash of inspiration that would somehow change that. I also wish I had the blinding flash of inspiration that would change the political calculus that keeps us from even attempting to tackle the subject of guns. But I don't have the magic formula for either. I really don't.
Megan, I didn't get a chance to ask Sun Min about infrastructure. I'm going to ask you. The president made it clear that this massive infrastructure bill, I think they're talking about, it was like $3 trillion to $4 trillion is going to be next on his agenda. So, you wrote about the perils of deficit spending. This is why I'm asking you this question. And our collective failure to consider the potential for inflation, let alone our collective failure to learn from the sins of the past, the mistakes of the past. The Fed Chairman Powell says, don't worry about inflation. We've got our eye on it. Don't worry about it. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is the same. Don't worry about inflation. We can handle it. So if they're saying that, why are you so concerned?
So I'm not so much concerned about immediate inflation, although I should say, look, the Fed does know how to deal with inflation that's getting out of control, but the way it knows how to control inflation is to engineer a recession. It's not, we keep talking about a soft landing, and the number of soft landings that have ever actually been achieved is functionally close to zero. And so, yes, we do. It's not like we're going to end up as Weimar Germany. But, it's really unpleasant to have the recession that you need if inflation ticks up to 3-4% and the Fed actually then has to do something and pull back. I think where they are is saying, look, we've been running loose monetary policy for decades now, and it doesn't seem to be producing the inflation you'd predicted. I think that's right. I don't know if and when inflation will show up, but I do think that people who are not taking that risk seriously, or who are just saying, well, the Fed knows how to control it, are being a little too blithe. My bigger worry is actually about the way that we're spending. And it's not all spending, right? There is an argument for when interest rates are very low, as they are now, borrowing money to spend on infrastructure. But this infrastructure bill is, in fact, like a long list of Democratic wish list items, of which infrastructure is only one actually fairly small part. And those things are just new spending commitments. The Democrats have so far not proven willing to raise the taxes that they would need in order to pay for that kind of massive new program. And in fact, what they're talking about doing is reversing some of the Trump tax cuts and using that to pay for this in part, not in full. By my calculation, even if you add in prescription drug price controls for Medicare, you're still about $1 trillion short on a $3 trillion program. But the problem is those Trump tax cuts were completely fiscally irresponsible. They should not have been passed because they weren't paid for. And now, instead of reversing them so that we can cover the deficit spending we shouldn't have been doing in the first place, Democrats are just kind of saying, YOLO, let's reverse them and use them to pay for new spending. And you also saw this with Obamacare, frankly, which was that, the Bush administration had done something unwise, and the Obama administration said, oh, well, we're going to reverse this and then do something unwise with it instead of covering the existing deficit. And I'm worried that we're getting this bipartisan consensus that it just doesn't matter how much money you spend. Ultimately, this money, I hate to be the Eeyore here, but we do actually eventually have to pay it back. It's not like free money falling from the skies. And I'm worried that not only parties, but even voters are starting to treat it this way. And I heard this when I said, why are we sending checks to people who are fully employed and not worse off financially than they were before the pandemic? And people were like, but I'm buying new furniture, this is not a response, right? This is just like, yes, I like buying new furniture too, but that's not actually a justification of this policy.
But Megan, as you said, YOLO, YOLO.
Right, right.
Gene, I just wonder on the infrastructure question, and to Megan's point, it's not just, I mean, it is a democratic / progressive wish list of priorities. A lot of it which has to do with jobs, either directly or peripherally, i.e., childcare, daycare things. Why shouldn't why shouldn't the White House stop calling it an infrastructure bill and call it a infrastructure package and call it a jobs package?
Because I think they think it sells better if they call it an infrastructure package, though I'm not sure that it does. I would call it a jobs package. Or you could split it in two and have your infrastructure package that's actually about infrastructure, which we really do need to spend some money on, and the jobs part of it, which I think is really important, especially to the extent that that we are talking about, and in fact moving toward a clean energy economy, and that's going to create all kinds of shifts and kinds of jobs and that sort of thing. But there's supposed to be something magical in Washington about the word infrastructure, and that's supposed to, when you say that word, it's supposed to guarantee votes from both parties, because who doesn't want a new spanking new bridge and highway interchange and community center in their congressional district. I'm not sure it still works that way, but the House is bringing back earmarks, and I think earmarks are they're kind of wasteful, but they actually do grease the wheel, and they get stuff done. So I'm kind of hopeful about that.
Yeah, I was going to say earmarks actually back in the day, even with all the criticism about them, they did get things done. So the great Catherine Finnerty, who is Washington Post Live producer, First Look producer, and she's leaving us. So she's leaving us, and so I'm using this moment to throw up rose petals at her feet and thank her for this, for all her work on this. But she devised this actually really clever question that starts out on China and ends on voting rights. And here's the question, because she notes that President Biden, in answering a question about China, made clear about his fears about the fragile nature of American democracy. And here's his quote: "I predict to you, your children or grandchildren are going to be doing their doctoral thesis on the issue of who succeeded, autocracy or democracy, because that is what is at stake, not just with China." And so the clever question that Catherine devised is this: if that is the case, shouldn't getting rid of the filibuster and bolstering voting rights be a top line priority? Gene, what do you think?
Well, voting rights certainly should be a top line priority, because I think the attempts, and let's face it, by the Republican Party to curtail voting rights, especially for voters of color across the country, these very targeted attempts that are going on now in a majority of states, are outrageous and anti-democratic, and we ought to be encouraging people to vote, rather than finding ways to keep them away from the polls. So I think that ought to be a top line priority, and then you get to the question of the filibuster, and if you can't get Republican votes right now, for even just the voting rights parts of HR 1, the big voting rights bill that has a whole bunch of other stuff in it too. But even if you just took out the voting rights parts, I don't think you could get Republican votes, certainly not 10. And so does that become a sort of definitional existential issue, for the Democratic majority in the Senate? And do they then have to carve out an exception for voting rights bills so they can get rid of the filibuster for that only, or go further and just get rid of the filibuster?
Mm-hmm.
But that's the question they're going to face.
Yeah.
and pretty soon. Mhm.
And Megan, I'm going to pull you into this conversation because President Biden went so far as to agree that the filibuster is, quote, a relic of the Jim Crow era, but he didn't make any definitive statements about pushing for its removal. Shouldn't it be a priority for the Democratic Party now, from your perspective?
Well, I mean, I think you've got a couple of problems on the filibuster. One of which is that Joe Manchin doesn't necessarily want the filibuster gone. Manchin doesn't want it gone, then it's not gone. The filibuster protects moderate Democrats. Joe Manchin's in a really tough spot. If he votes with a party too often, he will not be the senator from West Virginia for very long. It is a very conservative state, and that would be bad for Democrats because, frankly, the odds that any other Democrat could replace Joe Manchin in the Senate from that state seem really low. So, right, like, I don't know. Are you shaking your head because you disagree with me, or?
No. I'm shaking my head. I've been saying absolutely there is no other Democrat in West Virginia who could win statewide.
Right. Look, Joe Manchin might be willing to do a kind of dedicated carve out for voting rights. Although I tend to think that the empirical evidence that any of these measures do really anything to affect the outcome of anything other than extremely close elections is small, and it's more of a symbolic than a substantive issue. I think symbolically, make a stand for more people voting, but I actually don't think that it's probably going to move the needle in the way that Democratic voters expect. But symbolically, Joe Manchin is willing to go there. But more broadly, the filibuster provides him protection from having to take hard vote after hard vote after hard vote. And you've seen in the House where they don't have that protection, right? It's actually, people have been forced to, the moderate Democrats who get forced to take hard votes then often lose their seats because their district is just more conservative than they are. And for structural reasons, having to do less even with gerrymandering than just with how voters are distributed in this country, which is there's a lot of like 60-40 Republican, like rural ex-urban districts. And then there's a lot of 80-20 Democratic districts where I don't want to say wasting votes. Votes are never wasted, but you have a lot of votes that aren't actually helping you move the needle in national elections in those districts because you don't, anything over 50% doesn't actually help you. And so for those structural reasons, there are more conservative leaning states and districts than there are liberal leaning ones, and just numerically, and that makes things hard. And I'm just not sure that moderate Democrats really want to lose the protection that filibuster is providing them.
Gene, do you want to respond to that, or can I give you because we're almost out of time and I got one more question.
Well, I would just say, I mean, basically, I think Megan is right. I think it is, gerrymandering has a lot to do with the fact that those House districts work out that way. That's number one. And number two, it is a gamble by Democrats. Democrats are basically saying, we think we can be the majority party. We think we can, because we've got more voters. Because, they get rid of the filibuster, and then when they're back in the minority, they will get steamrollered in exactly the same way they're potentially about to steamroller the Republicans.
Yeah, well, I mean, one can argue no matter what, when Republicans take the majority, they steamroll, whether they've got a 1-seat majority or a 10-seat majority. Last question, Gene, to you, and that is real quickly, there were lots of questions about what's happening at the border. The one thing that didn't come up was, what does it mean that President Biden made Vice President Kamala Harris the point person for getting that situation solved? What does that signal to you?
That means that's what vice presidents are there for. You've got this hard problem. Not what you want to focus the presidential bully pulpit on. You want to be focused on the pandemic, but this other thing is happening. It needs to be dealt with, and here's your handy vice president. That's your job.
Mm-hmm. Megan, actually, last word to you. What does it signal to you that Vice President Harris is now the point person for the border?
Look, I think the border is almost an impossible problem because Joe Biden has two constituencies he's trying to speak to at the same time. And one is kind of the immigration hardliners in the Democratic Party who don't want to hear a lot about enforcement or deportation. They want to hear that these kids are going to be released into the United States. Most of them have relatives here, is my understanding. But on the other hand, he also doesn't want more kids coming because it's both bad political optics and because these are unaccompanied minors who are taking very dangerous journeys, and we shouldn't encourage that. And so what he wants to say to the people back home in Central America is, if you send your kid here, your kid's coming back on the next plane. This is a completely pointless exercise. Do not do this. And the problem is when you're the president of the United States, you can't speak to both. When you speak to one group, the other group hears you. And so it is a thankless and difficult task. I'm not sure he's going to reach an acceptable resolution. And so put the vice president in charge of it and hope that, that won't matter when he's at the top of the ticket in 2024.
Actually, I'm going to go a bit of overtime. Gene, am I remembering correctly? Weren't you a bureau chief, Washington Post bureau chief in Latin America?
In Buenos Aires, yeah.
In Buenos Aires.
A lot further south, yeah.
Yeah, a lot further south. But because I was wondering, because to Megan's point about the dangerous journey that these migrants are making, particularly unaccompanied minors, I mean, to call it dangerous is not hyperbolic. In fact, it might be downplaying how dangerous the journey is and why they're making it.
It's dangerous. Yeah, I mean, they're walking through Mexico, which is, a troubling prospect at best. It's incredibly dangerous, and the fact that families send or allow children to go on this journey or send them on this journey speaks to the conditions in those northern triangle Central American countries where they're fodder for the gangs. I mean, that's their daily reality, and they can get killed, and that's why they make this trek.
And we have gone way over time, but I really appreciate your time and coming back to First Look. Megan McArdle, Eugene Robinson, thank you very much. Have a great weekend.
Okay, you too.
You too.
And as always, thank you for tuning in. Join me again at 11:30 a.m. Eastern for a conversation with Congresswoman Judy Chu, chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, and Congressman Mark Takano, the group's second vice chair, about combating anti-Asian racism. Both members of Congress are from California. I urge you to tune in for this important discussion. And then as always, join me tonight for Brooks and Capehart on PBS NewsHour. Check your local listings. And then join me on Sunday on MSNBC, 10 a.m. Eastern for the Sunday show. Once again, I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Thank you very much for tuning in to Washington Post Live's First Look.